Putin versus Ukraine, the untold story of Ukraine's fight for survival. What do poisoned presidents, mysterious green soldiers, and a downed passenger jet have in common? They're all part of the wild, twisted saga of Ukraine versus Putin, a geopolitical thriller that started with nukes and ended with trenches. How did a peaceful protest turn into a full-blown war? Why did Russia annex Crimea without firing a single shot? And what on earth are cyborgs doing in an airport siege? Buckle up, because this isn't just history. It's a high-stakes drama with tanks, treaties, and betrayal. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how the biggest European war in decades was born and why it's far from over. Picture it. December 1991. The Soviet Union collapses like a Jenga tower built by drunk diplomats. Ukraine, once the USSR's second most powerful republic, wakes up with a hangover and a surprise inheritance. 1,700 nuclear warheads, including ICBMs capable of turning continents into craters. It was like finding out your grandma left you a dragon in her will. But Ukraine, being the responsible adult in the room, signed the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, promising to dismantle its nukes in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the US, and the UK. Everyone agreed. No nukes, no problems. Spoiler alert, problems came anyway. Fast forward to 2004. Ukraine's presidential election was a political soap opera starring Viktor Yanukovych, Russia's favorite, and Viktor Yushchenko, the West's pick. Yushchenko was poisoned with TCDD toxin, which is basically Agent Orange's evil cousin. He survived, but his face became a tragic testament to political sabotage. When Yanukovych won the election, the vote smelled fishier than a Moscow sushi bar. Mass protests erupted, known as the Orange Revolution, with nearly 20% of Ukraine's population taking to the streets. Miraculously, it remained peaceful, and after a rerun, Yushchenko won fair and square. In 2010, Yanukovych made a comeback, winning the presidency legitimately. But in 2013, he pulled a plot twist. He rejected an EU deal that would align Ukraine with Europe and instead cozied up to Russia's customs union. Ukrainians, dreaming of EU passports and IKEA stores, were furious. Protests exploded in Kiev's Independence Square, evolving into the Euromaidan movement. What started as peaceful sit-ins turned into violent clashes. By February 2014, snipers, Molotovs, and riot police turned the capital into a war zone. Over 100 protesters died, and Yanukovych fled to Russia like a villain escaping in a Bond movie. With Yanukovych gone, and Ukraine leaning west, Putin saw an opportunity. In late February 2014, he held a late-night meeting and said, "Let's get Crimea back." Russia sent in little green men, soldiers without insignia, who seized control of Crimea's parliament and military bases. A referendum was held under Russian occupation, and surprise, 95% voted to join Russia. The international community called it illegal, but Putin called it Tuesday. Thus, Crimea was annexed, and the world watched as maps were redrawn with a Sharpie. From 2014 to 2022, eastern Ukraine simmered with conflict. Russian-backed separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk declared independence, and fighting raged. In 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down, killing 298 people, another grim chapter in this undeclared war. Then came February 24, 2022. Putin announced a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, phrases that raised eyebrows and blood pressure worldwide. Russian tanks rolled in from Belarus, Russia, and Crimea, and the invasion began in earnest. If you're loving this wild ride through history, don't just sit there. Smash that subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and ring that notification bell like it's the Kremlin's front door. We've got more jaw-dropping stories, epic battles, and geopolitical plot twists coming your way. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single one. With Crimea in his pocket, Putin turned his gaze eastward. In the Donbass region, pro-Russian sentiment was simmering like a pot of borscht left on high heat. Enter the Donetsk People's Republic, DPR, and Luhansk People's Republic, LPR, two self-declared breakaway states with a dream to become part of Novorossiya, New Russia. On April 12, 2014, separatists stormed police stations and government buildings across eastern Ukraine. They looted armories and handed out AK-47s like party favors. Ukraine responded with the anti-terrorist operation ATO, sending in troops to reclaim the cities. The first showdown? Sloviansk. Ukraine gave the rebels 48 hours to leave. The rebels laughed, dug in, and promised to turn the city into Stalingrad 2.0. Gunfire erupted, helicopters flew, mortars rained. But the rebels weren't just angry locals. They had Russian-supplied anti-aircraft missiles and armored vehicles. Surprise! Eventually, Ukraine retook Sloviansk, but the war was just beginning. They pushed back in Mariupol, Donetsk Airport, and Kramatorsk, but the rebels kept multiplying like gremlins in a rainstorm. And many weren't even Ukrainian. Chechens, Serbs, Russians, and even fighters from South Ossetia joined the fray. Then came July 17, 2014. A Malaysian Airlines flight, MH17, was cruising peacefully over eastern Ukraine. Suddenly, a Buk missile streaked through the sky and obliterated the plane, killing all 298 people on board. Investigators traced the missile to Russia's 53rd Anti-Air Brigade. The launcher had been smuggled into Ukraine that very day and quietly returned to Russia after the strike. Russia? Wasn't us, they said, while vetoing a UN tribunal. The world? Furious. Despite the chaos, Ukraine was clawing back territory. By mid-August, they were eyeing the border checkpoints. The DPR's leader, Igor Girkin, sent a desperate message to Putin: "Help us or lose New Russia." That must have hit a nerve, because suddenly Russian tanks and troops started appearing like mushrooms after rain. Russia denied everything, even when Russian paratroopers were captured inside Ukraine. Their excuse? Oops, they got lost. Sure, because elite soldiers often take wrong turns into war zones. In Ilovaisk, Ukrainian forces thought they had won, but then, wham, they were surrounded. 3 weeks of brutal urban warfare followed. The city became a meat grinder. Ukraine was forced to retreat. Victory? Not quite. The war had only just begun. It was supposed to be a breakthrough. Ukrainian forces had surrounded the city of Ilovaisk, ready to deliver a knockout punch to the separatists. But then, boom, the trap snapped shut. Russian regulars and separatists launched a textbook artillery barrage that turned the city into a flaming blender of concrete and shrapnel. Buildings crumbled like stale cookies. Ukrainian soldiers caught in the crossfire were pounded into oblivion. A last-ditch rescue attempt failed spectacularly, and by the time the smoke cleared, Ukraine had lost nearly 1,000 troops. The rebels and Russians, about 850. It was a bloodbath. The disaster was so catastrophic that Ukraine's defense minister resigned, probably with a resignation letter that read, "Oops, my bad." The loss was a gut punch to the Ukrainian military and a wake-up call that brute force alone wouldn't win this war. Desperate to stop the bleeding, Ukraine, Russia, and the separatists sat down at the table and signed the Minsk agreements on September 5, 2014. It was supposed to be a ceasefire. A 15-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone, artillery withdrawal, foreign fighters out, humanitarian aid in, dialogue, peace, hugs, rainbows. But guess what? It did nothing. Why? Because it was a trust-fall exercise with no one catching anyone. Ukraine said, "We won't pull back until the mercenaries leave." The separatists said, "We won't tell the mercenaries to leave until we get autonomy." And Russia? We're not even here, bro. So the ink wasn't even dry before the bullets started flying again. Enter the Donetsk airport, a gleaming modern terminal that became the Alamo of Ukraine. On September 28th, the separatists launched a full-blown assault using BM-21 Grad rocket launchers, the kind of hardware that makes fireworks look like sparklers. The Ukrainians held firm. The airport shook. A bus stop exploded. Civilians died. Nobody knew who fired what because everyone was shooting in every direction like it was a Michael Bay movie. As the siege dragged on, the separatists got frustrated. One radioed in, "It's like there are cyborgs in there." And just like that, the defenders were dubbed the Cyborgs of Donetsk, wounded, exhausted, but unbreakable. But even cyborgs have limits. By January 2015, after months of shelling, tunnel invasions, and timed explosives, the airport was reduced to charred skeletons of concrete. The control tower collapsed. The terminal fell. Hundreds were dead. Thousands wounded. The cyborgs had lost the building, but won immortality. Meanwhile, Putin was sending in humanitarian convoys, which, oddly enough, were full of ammunition, tanks, and rocket launchers. Russia claimed it was helping oppressed Russian speakers. Ukraine called it what it was, an invasion with a mustache and a fake ID. And here's the kicker. Ukraine's own president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, grew up speaking Russian. So the whole protecting Russian speakers excuse? Yeah, not exactly airtight. By February 2015, the first Minsk deal was deader than disco. So they tried again with Minsk II. Same cast. Same promises, same results. The ceasefire was more like a pause button on a broken remote. Meanwhile, Russia was recruiting volunteers in broad daylight. Soldiers, cops, even firefighters were encouraged to join the fight. The pay? Up to $4,000 a month. Not bad for a vacation in a war zone. By mid-2015, the UK estimated that 42,000 Russian troops had fought in Ukraine. Russia still denied it, of course. They're just tourists, they said. Very enthusiastic, heavily armed tourists. By 2016, the front lines had frozen. But the war didn't stop, it just simmered. Artillery duels, sniper shots, skirmishes, death by 1,000 cuts. By 2021, the toll was staggering. 4,600 Ukrainian soldiers dead, 5,800 separatists dead, 500 Russian troops dead, 3,400 civilians dead, 172 children injured or killed by mines. Eastern Ukraine had become one of the most heavily mined places on earth. Cities were rubble, families displaced. 2 million Ukrainians had already fled their homes, many for the second time. And the politics? A mess. In Ukrainian-held Donbass, most wanted to stay in Ukraine. In separatist zones, up to 50% wanted independence. Accusations flew. Ukraine said separatists were hiding behind civilians. Separatists said Ukraine was targeting homes. The truth? War doesn't care who's right. It just destroys. It was a cold Thursday morning when the world woke up to explosions across Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, phrases that sounded like they were pulled from a Cold War villain's playbook. Within hours, Russian tanks rolled in from Belarus, Crimea, and Russia itself, targeting Kiev, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. Missiles struck airports, military bases, and civilian infrastructure. Social media lit up with footage of fireballs, sirens, and terrified families sheltering underground. Putin claimed he was protecting Russian-speaking Ukrainians from genocide. But the irony? Ukraine's own president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is a native Russian speaker and Jewish. So, the denazification claim? Yeah, not exactly airtight. Everyone expected Ukraine to fold in days, but Zelenskyy, in a t-shirt and flak jacket, stood firm. "I need ammunition, not a ride," he told the West, refusing evacuation. The Ukrainian military, backed by volunteers and grandmas with Molotov cocktails, held Kiev against all odds. The West responded with sanctions that hit Russia like a sledgehammer. Oligarchs lost yachts, banks were cut off from SWIFT, NATO countries poured in weapons, and Ukraine became the most heavily armed non-member in history. The invasion triggered mass protests worldwide, from Berlin to Tokyo. Refugees flooded into Europe, over 8 million Ukrainians displaced. Gas prices soared. Food shortages loomed. And suddenly, everyone knew where Donbass was. Russia's initial push toward Kiev failed spectacularly. Ukrainian forces ambushed convoys, blew up bridges, and turned tractors into tank trucks. By April, Russia retreated from northern Ukraine and refocused on the east and south. The war became a grind. Cities like Mariupol were flattened. Bakhmut turned into a meat grinder. Russia deployed Wagner mercenaries, while Ukraine launched counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, retaking swaths of territory. By late 2022, the war settled into a brutal stalemate. Trenches, drones, and artillery duels dominated the landscape. Ukraine begged for tanks, jets, and long-range missiles. The West delivered slowly. Russia mobilized hundreds of thousands of conscripts. Casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. As of 2025, the war rages on. Ukraine fights for survival. Russia fights for pride. The world watches, weary but resolute. And somewhere in a bunker, Putin still insists it's not a war. It's a special operation. But history knows better. For many years, the world watched, hoped, waited. Maybe, just maybe, the war would fizzle out like it had in Georgia or Moldova. But Ukraine's war wasn't a one-act play. It was a tragedy in progress. And behind the curtain, Putin was sharpening his next act, a full-scale invasion that would shake the world. And that's just one chapter in this epic saga of power, protest, and perseverance. If you found this story as gripping as a thriller and as wild as history gets, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tap the notification bell so you're the first to know when we drop the next explosive episode. Like, share, and comment below, because history isn't just written, it's retold by those who care. Stay curious, stay bold, and we'll see you in the next one.